So let us dive right into the report that you have so graciously launched for us. And I'd like to turn your attention to a short video that will be showing up here. Pay attention to it. It's got more facts and figures. I shall test you at the end of this. What's Tanzania's GDP growth rate presumed to be per capita? It's on the video. So watch the video, and then I shall invite Emmanuel Mungunasi to provide the economic outlook. So please roll the video. Thank you.
Official data show economic activity in Tanzania gradually recovered in the third quarter of 2021. The surge was generally driven by the hospitality, mining, and electricity sectors. Despite these promising signs, activity in most sectors remains below pre-pandemic levels. As a result, the World Bank estimates a real GDP growth rate of 4.3% and a poverty rate of 27% in 2021. Real GDP growth could reach 4.5 to 5.5% in 2022 and nearly 6% over the medium term. This is subject to improvements in the external environment and supportive policies for the private sector. Priority policy actions should continue to focus on expanding efforts to prevent, detect, and treat COVID-19 while enhancing the transparency of public health information, building a resilient and inclusive social protection system while protecting and empowering women, supporting viable firms and promoting private investment in women's access to assets and economic opportunities, improving expenditure efficiency, mobilizing domestic revenue, and borrowing responsibly.
Thank you. I think let's go straight into the presentation. Karibu, Doctor. We'll move the podium so you're not so squashed here.
Thank you very much, Aidan. So let me remind you what happened in 2020. And the big message from this slide is because of the global pandemic, per capita GDP in Tanzania contracted. And of course, I mean, you know, we measure per capita GDP by taking the GDP growth and the population growth rate, and the difference is what we call per capita GDP. And the graph on the left, it shows you the trend since 1991 to 2023 in terms of the GDP growth, population growth, which is the blue line, and of course GDP growth, per capita GDP growth, which is the red line, and the bars are GDP growth. So if you look at the graph, you see in 1991 to 1993, we had a contraction in per capita GDP of around 1.6, and this happens again in 2020 when the COVID hit in this country. So what we are saying in this slide is, of course, Tanzania avoided recession in 2020 because many countries in the world normally went into recession, but we didn't. But of course, the GDP growth slowed a lot. We moved from 5.8% growth rate in 2019 to 2.0 in 2020. Of course, I mean, the big issue was the tourism sector, which was mostly severely hit, but of course the export-related sectors, which are also negatively affected. And as a result, we see the GDP per capita contracting. And of course, I mean, the poverty rate as well also increased, and we estimate that the international poverty line, which is $1.9 a day, increased from 49.3% in 2019 to 50.4% in 2020. And of course, I mean, the big issue was the households who are relying on self-employment and informal micro enterprises. We saw it in urban areas. So the urban poverty was the one which was driving the numbers when it comes to poverty increase. Now, in this slide, it's a kind of promising news in the sense that things are changing from 2021, and what we are showing there is, I only picked these three graphs, but in the report you will see more than this. But what we just picked is the mobility, tourism, and trade. And what we are saying, when it comes to mobility, we are saying mobility is now rising. I mean, starting from somewhere from mid-July last year. And of course, it's more on the recreation and retail places. People are moving, I'm seeing now a lot of movement towards those places, but also in the workplace as well. And of course, on tourism, we are also seeing some recovery in tourism. Of course, the chart shows you tourism arrivals and the travel earnings, which is basically driven by the numbers in terms of the tourism. And of course, we are also seeing the trade rising as well. And there, what we just picked is the export of goods and services, the investment and things like that. So we are seeing all this recovering, but of course, as Mara pointed out before, we are not yet to pre-pandemic levels, and you can of where it was before the pandemic. Now, the other good news, which I think is very important to remember for Tanzania, is at least Tanzania has an advantage. The macro framework is sound and can support a stronger policy response and for recovery and more private sector-led growth. And there what we are trying to show, we are showing inflation, we are showing fiscal balance, and we are showing reserves, and we are showing external balance. Normally, inflation is very, very important in the sense that, I mean, the monetary policy normally intends to have stability in the inflation. So when you have low inflation, it means you can still do a lot in terms of adjusting the monetary policy in order to support your growth. But also, when we look at the fiscal balance as well, we are seeing the fiscal deficit has averaged somewhere around 2% of GDP or slightly higher than 2% of GDP, which is also very low in the sense that it can allow you expand a little bit the fiscal deficit in order to create more space, in order to support whatever some sectors which were affected, and also support your investment program and the like, including social services as well. So we have space there, which I think is very good news. But of course, we have high level of reserves. And what we are seeing, currently the reserves are sitting somewhere near 6.7 billion US dollars, which can support imports of goods and services for the next seven months, which I think is also good news. But also on the external side as well, we are also seeing the fiscal and the external current account deficit, which is somewhere around 2% of GDP, which I think is also very low, and I think it's very good news. But of course, there is a problem, because I mean, when you look at the current deficit of around 2.0% of GDP in 2021, somewhere July 2021, then you see a lot of it is being financed by external loans and to general government, but not much in terms of the foreign direct investment. And what you can see from the bars as well, the blue bars normally are showing the foreign direct investment. You see some kind of declining trend. And I think that one is something which we also need to look at it in order to make sure that at least also that needs to go up, which is part of what we encourage in terms of investments. Of course, now looking forward, what we are saying, uncertainty still remains very high. But of course, what we are saying, I mean, the recovery or the pace of recovery will depend on external developments, domestic health policies, as well as private sector policies. What do we do on those fronts? But of course, external environment, global environment is also very, very important. If we have positive development there, we are good. So the chart we are showing there, you see the heavy line, the black line. It's what we call the baseline in terms of assuming all those things happen in the positive direction for Tanzania. Global developments are good, health policies are good, private sector policies are good, then we're probably going to have the growth rate of GDP of around 5.4 in 2022, and then 5.9 in 2023. But of course, it can change. What the bar shows, I mean, the chart shows you, it can change. If we do a lot in terms of those policies, then we're probably going to get a higher growth rate. But if we don't do enough on those, we're also likely going to fall below the 5.4 we are saying. So it's important to recognize that we are assuming a lot will happen in terms of policies to support private sector, a lot in terms of domestic health policies, but favorable external developments. So the evolution of pandemic and the vaccination program globally and domestically will play a large role in terms of future growth. What happens to the pandemic in globally and internally, it's very, very important to take into consideration when we are determining the future. But of course, we are also saying continued vaccination progress, improved regional trade and cooperation, and policy reforms to improve business environment are important to support inclusive and resilient private sector-led growth. So business environment, I think it's a big issue. We need to do a lot in terms of improving business environment in order to attract private investment and the like. Of course, we are also saying that risk includes, risk to whatever we are projecting will include the emergence of new coronavirus variants, subdued private capital flows, inflationary pressures, and supply bottlenecks. So those are the risks which may counter our growth trajectory in terms of the numbers we are projecting. So what we are saying in terms of the policy recommendation, we continue to emphasize what we have been saying in the previous two economic updates. And of course, what we are saying, I mean, the policymaker should strengthen its pandemic response in the short term, but also laying the groundwork for private sector-led recovery and inclusive growth over the medium term. And of course, we say the priority policy areas should aim at saving lives by expanding, preventing, detecting, and treat COVID while enhancing the transparency of the data and public information, health information. We are also saying the second one is we need to protect the poor and the vulnerable, and by this we are also suggesting that we need to continue building resilient and inclusive social protection system while protecting and empowering women. And third, we need our policies to support jobs, business recovery, and growth. And in this area, what we are saying, I mean, we need to think on how we can support the viable firms, including those in the tourism sector, which were heavily affected by the COVID. And of course, we need to promote private investment, both local and foreign. And we need to expand women's access to assets and economic opportunities. And lastly, we need to expand fiscal space to do more in terms of supporting the firms, infrastructure development, but also social spending, including education and health. And in this area, what we are saying, we need to care more in terms of improving expenditure efficiency, making sure that whatever cents we are spending, we are getting value for it. Of course, we need to continue mobilizing domestic revenue in a manner that supports private sector as well. Some numbers there as well in terms of the debt and the debt service. So we need to make sure that whatever we borrow, it supports growth and export orientation in this economy. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. There's one thing you mentioned there on that slide of potential economic growth for the country. And some of the uncertainties were to do with COVID, to do with global recovery. I think in the report it talks about supply chain constraints. Putin was not included. And that's a major uncertainty, isn't it? There's a wonderful report about using scenarios to try and, for the IMF, try and understand how to respond to particular crises. And the IMF says we live in a tuna world, okay, not a tuna sandwich, a tuna world, T-U-N-A. T, turbulent, very turbulent. U, unpredictably uncertain. Not only is it uncertain, but the uncertainty itself is unpredictable. N is novel, these new challenges, everything from social media and artificial intelligence to, well, new in this generation, 77 years ago was the last time there was a war in Europe. And A, ambiguous. We don't know how it all ends. So in this tuna world, we might have to update our economic update for Tanzania in a few months, won't we? So let's just keep that in mind as we also try to think about domestic policy making, especially when talking about expanding access for economic opportunities to women. So I'd like now to turn your attention again to the screens, and we look at part 2 of the report. And there will be a short video followed by a presentation by sector leader of the World Bank, Ya Opong. So let's watch the video first, and then I'll invite Ya for her presentation.
Wanaume walio wengi wanaishi kwa namna ya fikra za mfumo dume. Hasa mfumo dume ule ndio unaoathiri wanaume kuwaona wanawake kwamba bado hawawezi.
Mila na desturi pia zinamkandamiza mwanamke,
kwamba wanawake wanakuwa hawana haki ya kumiliki ardhi.
Jambo la kwanza naweza kusema kuna jambo kubwa la urasimishaji au formalization ya biashara, ambao wengi kwanza wanakuwa hawajui au hawana uwezo.
Kama vile mteja anaweza kuja kuchukua kitu hapa akakulipa jioni ya siku mbili, hizo ndio changamoto zenyewe.
Wanaume kwa asilimia kubwa wana nafasi ya kupata taarifa, kukutana kwenye maamuzi, lakini kwa wanawake vikundi vyao vya kiujasiriamali kimsingi havina taarifa sahihi za kuwawezesha kupiga hatua katika biashara zao ndogo ndogo.
Tunapenda basi serikali ituwezeshe tupate mikopo midogo midogo.
Ili mwanamke na kundi kubwa la wanawake waweze kunyanyuka, lazima wawepo katika ngazi za kufanya maamuzi.
Mwanamke ambaye anafanya maamuzi ana uwezo wa kufanya vitu vikubwa zaidi kuliko ambaye hafanyi maamuzi mpaka afanywe na mwanaume.
Moja ya eneo kubwa ambayo wanaweza kuongeza usawa ni katika kazi zilizo rasmi. Kuhakikisha wanawake wanakuwa viongozi, kuhakikisha wanawake wasomi au wanawake wanasomeshwa ili waweze kuchukua kazi zilizo rasmi zaidi.
Lakini kwa mimi jinsi ninavyoamini, naamini mwanamke akiwezeshwa anaweza vizuri na anaweza kutekeleza majukumu yako vizuri na ikawa sawa kabisa.
Elimu, uchumi na siasa au ngazi za maamuzi.
Mwanamke anaweza.
Mwanamke
ni kiongozi.
Mwanamke
ni jembe.
Mwanamke ana makusudi yake ya kipekee.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Ya Opong, and I'm the sector leader for sustainable development, based here in Tanzania, working with the country management unit. And it is my pleasure this morning to present on the special topic of our 17th economic update on empowering women, expanding access to assets and economic opportunities. And I'd like to do that in 4 parts, if I may. For the first part, I'm going to give a quick overview of some of the major progress that has been achieved in areas of gender equality in Tanzania. And then I'll move on to drill down a little bit more into the economic data and the economic indicators and look at the progress and the gaps. And then I'll look at the evidence on how expanding access to assets and boosting women's empowerment has key economic gains. And I'll finally end with looking at the policy options that are available based on global evidence. So if we look at the evidence, we see that overall progress has been made in key areas of gender equality in Tanzania. If we look at family planning, we see that there's been a drop in the total fertility rate from 6.2 to 4.8 births from 91 to 2019. We see that between 92 and 2010, there was a drop in unmet needs from family planning from 28 to 22%. We see that in related issues of education and voice and agency, the gender parity in net enrollment has been achieved at the primary and lower secondary levels. And we see that protections have been put in place to to establish women's and children's protection committees. Gender desks have been established and one-stop centers. So protections put in place to really try and prevent gender-based violence. Also, if we look at issues of illness and disease, we see that, we see that national health guidelines have been updated, and the agenda for accelerating and preventing HIV is also has been accelerated. Nevertheless, I think the main big picture issue here is that there is room for growth. Yes, there have been successes, and yes, there's been progress, but there's room for growth. For example, if we look at the total fertility rate, at 4.8 births per woman, this still remains higher than the average for sub-Saharan Africa. If we look at the adolescent fertility rate, at 115 births per 1,000 women, this also remains higher than rates for sub-Saharan Africa. Although, as was mentioned, gender parity and net enrollment has been achieved at primary and lower secondary levels, it has not been achieved at upper secondary levels. And at 40% and 44% respectively, rates of gender-based violence and intimate partner violence remain high. We also see, in terms of HIV/AIDS, that more women than men are infected, although again, the rates have gone down. If we now look at key economic indicators, we also see that over the past decades, Tanzania has made considerable progress in key indicators. Over the several decades, the country, as we know, has successfully transitioned to low middle income country status. We know, as was mentioned earlier, that the labor force participation rate is above the sub-Saharan African average of 68. Here in Tanzania, it's 80. And that the ratio of female to male participation in wage and salaried work also increased, 35% to 64% from 2000 to 2019. And that between 2004-05 and 2015-16, the share of women engaged in unpaid agricultural work fell from 78 to 64%. And that between 2011 and 2017, the share of women with a bank account rose from 14% to 42%. So again, if we look at the big picture, there have been some successes and considerable progress. Nevertheless, if we turn now to the challenges, we see that women do continue to face significant challenges across several economic dimensions. As was mentioned earlier, female wage workers earn about 88 cents for each dollar earned by men. At an average of $158 per month, the earnings of female wage workers are below the averages for many comparable sub-Saharan African countries. And was also mentioned earlier, the gender gap in agricultural productivity is estimated at 20 to 30%. And 97% of that gap is explained by women's low access to male family labor. If we turn now to land ownership and access to assets, we also see that more women than men are insecure in terms of access to land. Approximately 26% of men are sole owners of land compared to 7% of women. And that 80% of male landowners lack a title deed compared to 86% of women. If we turn now to home ownership, we see that 38% of women own a house, either alone or jointly, compared to 41% of men. And 7% of women claim sole ownership, compared to 26% of men. If we turn now to areas of financial inclusion, we see that on the positive side, the share of women with an account rose from 14% to 42% from 2011 to 2017. And yet this 42% compares with 52% of men at 2017 had an account at a formal financial institution or mobile money provider. And we see that there are also gender differentials and familiarity with the formal financial sector, with 13% of men in the first quintile who've been inside a bank compared to just 4% of women. So now if we turn to the third part of the presentation, looking at expanding access to assets and boosting women's empowerment, and look at the evidence. If we turn back to the agricultural sector, we see that bridging the gender gap in agricultural productivity in and of itself can boost a country's GDP. And estimates suggest that closing the gender gap in agricultural productivity in the Tanzanian context could lift approximately 80,000 Tanzanians out of poverty every year, increase annual agricultural output by 2.7%, and boost annual GDP by 0.86%. Reducing gender gaps in the labor force participation can also increase GDP. In a recent study here in Tanzania found that closing the difference between male and female employment in Tanzania could increase long-term per capita GDP by 4.8%. If we now look at issues related to land and assets and how crucial they are in supporting economic development, we see a number of pieces of evidence that we'd like to point to today. If we look at land tenure security, we see that it's associated with increased investments in land conservation, for example. A study in Rwanda found that individuals whose plots had been registered were 10 percentage points more likely to invest in soil conservation and 15 percentage points more likely among female-headed households. If we look at financial inclusion, we see that it's linked with lower poverty rates and increased intra-household bargaining power. It can boost intra-household bargaining power and promote more equitable roles within the community, as some studies have demonstrated. We also see that equitable access to assets is core to promoting women's economic empowerment. And asset ownership among women is associated with increased decision-making power regarding agricultural production, improved access to labor, and greater control over household expenditure decisions. If we reflect a little on the pandemic, we see that it has also disproportionately affected women's employment opportunities. And as was mentioned, the Tanzania high-frequency phone surveys between June and July of 2021, of the reasons stated for not working, around 26% of women stated illness, compared to 16% of men. 10% of women stated business closed as the reason for not working, compared to 3% of men. I would like to end by reflecting a little bit on the policy environment and on the opportunities and the evidence of what it takes to boost women's economic opportunities and access to assets. And I think the main point here is that it requires a holistic approach, an approach that touches on a number of different interventions. Expanding women-tailored apprenticeship programs and offering business and life skills and training to female entrepreneurs has been shown to be effective. I want to mention a program in Liberia which offered technical skills and life skills training to young girls and led to a 50% increase in employment. Another example is from Togo, where a business training program working with micro-entrepreneurs found that women who received personalized training increased their profits by 40%. We also see that offering behavioral interventions to promote financial inclusion among women makes a difference. Providing women with financial accounts is associated with increased savings, boosted investment in businesses, and increased daily expenditure. If we turn now to interventions related to land and the agricultural sector, we see that strengthening land rights, women's land rights in particular, by offering land titling subsidies and providing incentives to co-title also makes a difference. And here we could point to enforcing the Lands Act and the Village Lands Act from 1999, which seek to address the gender discrimination that women often face in land registration and in securing land tenure. In terms of bridging gaps in agricultural productivity and ensuring women have equal access to inputs, here the focus could be on ensuring equal access to pesticides, to fertilizers, ensuring that agricultural extension services are expanded to women, to female crop owners, and are better tailored to their needs, addressing any financial limitations and restrictive gender norms which prevent female farmers from hiring more productive male labor. And then finally, I want to end by saying that another key area of attention is to help girls finish school and enter the workforce, and really pushing forward the end child marriage agenda and enacting strategies to empower girls. Evidence shows that conditional cash transfer programs, for example, have been proven effective for keeping female students enrolled in schools. And I'd finally like to end by looking at enforcing the ruling from the High Court of Tanzania in 2016 that marriage of girls under 18 years of age is unconstitutional, and the subsequent ruling from the Court of Appeals subsequently reaffirming this. So those are just some of the plethora of activities and interventions and policy approaches that could be taken to boost women's economic opportunities and access to assets. And I'd like to end there. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, yeah. That was a very rich insight into progress, room for growth. I like the way you put it that way. The World Bank has its own language, when it wants to say tough messages, puts them in a positive spin. Room for growth, which means we can improve, right? And also some of the both policy level interventions, I think, but the ones I found also quite fascinating are the one-on-one, personal, sort of emotionally intelligent interventions to make sure that women are able to access these assets and they're able to access the economic opportunities and use them in the most productive ways possible. So thank you very much. Thank you both for those presentations and for those insights from the report.